Hey guys, tonight we crawl under a linen blanket that smells faintly of smoke, wool, and unspoken expectations. The walls around you are stone cold, your straw mattress is just slightly better than a sack of potatoes, and the air in the room is thick with candles, soot, and mystery. Because tonight we're not talking castles or crusades, we're talking about what actually happened when the torches were snuffed out. Welcome to medieval intimacy. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this with your romantic illusions intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're watching from and what time your local bells would be tolling right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You press your hand into the coarse sheets and immediately feel the uneven stuffing beneath a haphazard mix of straw, feathers, and possibly a handful of mouse droppings. The medieval bed is less an oasis of comfort and more a symbol of status. If you're lucky enough to be in a bed at all, it probably isn't yours. And if you are married, you've got company. Always. Parents, siblings, even the family pig curled up nearby. Yes, that's right, bed sharing wasn't intimate, it was economical. A private room for two? That's pure nobility. For the rest, sex happened within earshot of an entire extended family. Romance is a strong word here. Survival is more accurate. Your partner lies beside you, perhaps your spouse, or maybe the person your parents decided would best merge cattle and acreage. Love matches were rare, especially among the peasantry. Marriages were made by contracts, not candlelight. And even if you were fond of your partner, there wasn't much room for flirting in daily life when you're both covered in mud, sweat, and 2 weeks of unwashed linen. Now, you're expected to produce Aristotelian sans sand, not enjoy it too much. Mainstream historical fact: the church, which shaped nearly every aspect of medieval life, was deeply suspicious of pleasure, especially the kind that makes you grin afterward. Sex was for procreation only, and even married couples were urged to avoid excess. How much is excess, you ask? Some theologians suggested once a week was pushing it, unless it was Sunday, or during Lent, or Advent, or a feast day, or a fast day, or... Okay, so basically, don't enjoy yourself. There were manuals. No, not those kinds of manuals. Priests and confessors had guides to acceptable sexual conduct, including when and how couples were allowed to be together. Anything unnatural, which sometimes just meant the woman being on top, could be considered a sin worthy of penance. And if you dared to enjoy yourself too obviously, you were teetering on the edge of mortal peril. Yes, even moaning was frowned upon. Sorry. But here's the quirky tidbit. While the official line was somber and joyless, people absolutely ignored it. Documents reveal couples slipping into haylofts, priests having affairs with widows, and brothels doing booming business just down the street from cathedrals. There was even a market for aphrodisiac recipes, scrawled on scraps of parchment in Latin shorthand, just to keep them secret. Historians still argue whether most medieval people actually followed church doctrine in the bedroom more, whether it was more like a divine guideline you nodded at, then quietly disregarded when no one was looking. One thing's clear, despite the sermons, sex wasn't absent from medieval life. It was simply layered under shame, secrecy, and straw. Your bed creaks. You shift, listening to the wind rattle the wooden shutters. In the absence of privacy, intimacy became coded. A brush of the hand under the supper table, a long look during a feast, a whispered joke about the size of someone's sausage that somehow still makes it into the town's oral tradition 100 years later. If you lived in a small village, everyone knew your business. Who was sneaking out at night? Who got mysteriously pregnant? Who was married, but not particularly faithful? And if you were caught, punishments ranged from public confession to flogging, though ironically, the more powerful you were, the easier it was to laugh it off. You pull the blanket up to your chin, though it's rough and slightly damp. That's not the worst part. The worst part is what's not in the room. Soap, towels, anything resembling deodorant. Hygiene was wildly inconsistent. And let's just say you weren't always lying beside someone who smelled like lavender and mint. But despite all of that, the rules, the cold, the smell people still fell in love. They still made babies. They still found time, however brief, to connect. And maybe, just maybe, they smiled afterward, even if the church frowned upon it. You roll over, listening to someone snoring softly on the floor nearby. Life in medieval times wasn't glamorous, but it was real. Messy, awkward, human, and sometimes, under the weight of all that wool and judgment, it was even tender. The room hasn't changed much, but now you feel the weight of something heavier than the blanket expectation. The church bell in the village square tolls through the misty morning air, but its sound seems to echo inside your own head. Because when it comes to pleasure, the church wasn't just wagging its finger, it was practically writing a full instruction manual in flaming script across the sky. Welcome to the morality war. You glance at the wooden crucifix above the hearth. It's not just decoration. It's a 24/7 reminder that someone's always watching. And no, not your mother-in-law in the next cot. Something a little higher up. Mainstream historical fact: throughout the Middle Ages, the Christian church maintained tight control over social and sexual norms. And it wasn't just about right and wrong, it was about when, how, and even why you could be intimate. The prevailing doctrine, crafted by thinkers like Augustine and later polished by Aquinas, declared that sex was only acceptable within marriage and solely for the purpose of procreation. Anything else, sinful, possibly demonic. At the very least, something you should feel terribly guilty about afterward. And so, desire, this universal human experience, became a battlefield. Wanting your spouse too much? That's lust. Wanting someone who wasn't your spouse? Mortal sin. Wanting but not doing anything about it? Still sin, because even your thoughts were fair game for damnation. You think about that time you caught the blacksmith's apprentice winking at the butcher's daughter, and how her father went to confession the next day like he'd seen a ghost. These weren't just flirtations. They were acts with spiritual consequences. Here's where things get weirder. Quirky tidbit: priests, despite being celibate in theory, often offered advice on sex from the pulpit and in confessionals. Imagine spilling your most intimate secrets to someone who's technically never done the thing they're judging you for. And yet, penitential handbooks used by confessors listed penalties for acts with more detail than a medieval cookbook. 1 kiss outside of marriage, 3 days fasting, touching inappropriately, longer penance. Intercourse out of wedlock? Oh, honey, you better bring a sleeping bag you're fasting and praying for years. Historians still argue whether the average priest actually enforced these penances, or if most just nodded and muttered something about avoiding temptation. Records suggest the rules were strict, but enforcement? A little interpretive, especially if the sinner could offer a chicken or two as penance. Yes, indulgences existed long before Luther blew a gasket over them. Still, the official stance was clear. Pleasure equals danger, especially for women. Female desire was either dismissed as non-existent or feared as wild and untamable. In some treatises, a woman who enjoyed sex too much was considered morally suspect, maybe even a witch in the making. And yet, marriage manuals often warned husbands not to neglect their wife too long, lest she seek warmth elsewhere. Quite the theological juggling act. You shift again, feeling the hard edge of straw poking your side. The bed, like the doctrine, is unforgiving. But then you remember the unofficial rule book, the one written in glances, behind tavern barrels, in haylofts and bathhouses. Because while the church tried to dictate the rhythm of every heartbeat, people still danced to their own desires. Take, for instance, carnival season. During these few weeks of sanctioned chaos, towns turned upside down. Drunken revelry, masks, music and, yes, plenty of moral lapses. It was as if people collectively exhaled after holding their breath all year. Priests would preach against it. Nobody listened. Or think about the troubadours, those wandering poets of courtly love. Their songs were all about longing, obsession, and, often very married, ladies who made knights go weak in the knees. Sure, the physical side was usually implied rather than spelled out, but everyone knew what was being sung about, and nobody stopped clapping. Still, the church tried. Edicts were issued, public floggings happened, brothels were sometimes banned, only to quietly reopen when the local economy realized it couldn't function without them. Because even when religion declared war on the body always found a loophole. You lie still, listening to the rhythm of your own breath. You're starting to get it now. This wasn't a society without desire. It was a society obsessed with controlling it, regulating it, categorizing it like a forbidden spice they couldn't quite throw away. They feared it, yes, but they were also fascinated. And so, bedroom life became a constant negotiation between guilt and longing, between law and laughter, between what was preached and what was practiced. As the fire dies down to embers and you tuck the coarse blanket around your shoulders, you realize something oddly comforting. The morality war was never truly won, not by the church, not by shame, not even by fear, because beneath it all, under the layers of sermons and self-restraint, medieval people were still human, and the heart, as it turns out, is a terrible listener. You wake up with the faint ache of straw pressing against your ribs, and the sensation that someone or something is watching. It's not the church this time. It's society, the neighbors, the law, the distant uncle who suddenly cares a lot about who you're courting. Because now, your attention turns to the peculiar rules of medieval intimacy, who you were allowed to touch and who was totally off limits. Let's start with the obvious. Incest. Modern taboos about cousins and siblings? The medieval church doubled down mostly. You weren't supposed to marry anyone within 7 degrees of consanguinity. That's not 7 people. That's 7 steps in a complicated family tree that very few peasants could even begin to diagram. So naturally, most people didn't know they were breaking the rule until, well, after the wedding. Oops. Mainstream historical fact. The church did, in fact, annul marriages that violated these kinship laws, even after the couple had been together for years and had children. Entire family lineages were sometimes upended because someone finally realized, wait a second, your great-grandma's sister married my great-grandpa's cousin? You can imagine the papal paperwork nightmare. But, naturally, wealth helped lubricate the rules. Nobility could request papal dispensations, essentially, holy hall pacesto, marry their 3rd or 4th cousins, especially if it involved land, titles, or, an alliance against France. Peasants, less lucky. If your marriage was deemed invalid due to bloodlines, you might find yourself cast out not just from your home, but from your community. And good luck explaining that to your kids. Now here's the quirky tidbit. The same church that preached spiritual purity also made extremely detailed records of who could and could not marry whom, sometimes drawing up literal family trees with notes like no marriage, shared ancestor on great-grandmother's side, possibly a goat farmer, and yes, someone in a medieval scriptorium got paid to copy those out. Monks probably had the medieval version of family tracking spreadsheet, except on parchment. Then there were the legal barriers. Class mattered, big time. A noblewoman marrying a merchant? Scandalous. A serf running off with a knight? Good luck with that. The ideal was to marry within your station, not necessarily for love, but for economic and social stability. So while love may have fluttered through the air like dandelion fluff, marriage was pure calculation. And then we reached the really spicy section of the ledger. Forbidden relationships with clergy. Oh yes, Priests and nuns were meant to be celibate, as pure as their white vestments. But the reality? Not quite. Communities often turned a blind eye when Father Gerald took frequent pastoral visits to Widow Beatrix's house. And let's just say more than one convent had its fair share of unexpected baptisms, if you catch my drift. Historians still argue whether the church's strict sexual codes were more idealized than enforced. Confessionals were overflowing, but so were the brothels. Monastic life was supposed to be free from worldly temptations, yet monastic scandals pop up like mushrooms in old court records. Even popes, those paragons of virtue, were known to father children. Illegitimate, of course, officially, politely, very quietly. The rulebook also had opinions about interfaith intimacy. Christian and Jew, Christian and Muslim, forbidden, sometimes violently. In many regions, laws forbade such unions entirely. But again, people being people, it still happened. Secretly, sometimes dangerously. There are whispered stories of star-crossed lovers who defied everything, choosing passion over doctrine, only to be punished or worse, erased from history. Then there's the law of the land, manorial courts and local justices who handle cases of fornication, adultery, or inappropriate behavior. Imagine being dragged into a medieval courtroom because someone saw you holding hands in the orchard with the wrong person. There were fines, public shaming, stocks, even forced marriages, which sounds romantic until you realize it usually involved a terrified teenager, a pushy priest, and zero consent. You glance over at your imaginary partner, lying on the other side of the straw-stuffed mattress, and wonder, would this have been allowed? Did someone have to bribe the priest to look the other way? Did an uncle storm out of the wedding feast muttering about family disgrace? Is all possible. Even more complicated were rules about widows and remarriage. If your spouse died, you couldn't just pick someone new and ride off into the plague sunset. Nope. First, there had to be a period of mourning. For women, this could last years. For men, sometimes just until the next market day. Bit of a double standard, don't you think? And while we're here, let's not forget how much control families had over young women's choices. A daughter's virtue was a family asset. Her marriage was a transaction. Her feelings, optional. Romantic love did exist courtly, poetic, sometimes tragic but in daily life. Love was often sacrificed at the altar of land disputes and sheep counts. So now you understand why intimacy in the Middle Ages was less about chemistry and more like assembling flat-pack furniture lots of diagrams, rigid instructions, and something important always missing. And yet, people found loopholes, secret meetings, illicit letters, hand-carved tokens passed in church. Human beings are stubborn that way. They find each other. Even through walls of rules and generations of disapproval, you shift in bed, eyes adjusting to the moonlight. Somewhere out there in the vast tapestry of medieval life, another forbidden couple might be doing the same, stealing a moment, dodging a law, bending history just enough to touch. The candle flickers now, casting dancing shadows across the uneven wall. You pull your blanket up higher, not from cold, but from the sheer absurdity of what you're about to hear. Because while everyone talks about how repressed the Middle Ages were, you're about to meet the rebels, the rule breakers, and the everyday folks who basically said, yeah, no thanks, to all the church's ideas about intimacy. Welcome to the underground world of medieval hookups. Let's be clear, mainstream historical fact sex outside of marriage was a sin. A big one. The kind that got you shamed, fined, or if you were really unlucky stoned. But did that stop people? Absolutely not. In fact, medieval cities had entire districts dedicated to making sure that, let's say, needs were met. Let's take Paris, for example. By the 13th century, it had a whole licensed red light district where sex workers could operate legally provided they followed certain rules, like not dressing above their station or working on Sundays. Think of it as a medieval version of zoning laws, but for pleasure. The church disapproved, obviously, but authorities tolerated it. Why? Because, believe it or not, regulated sin was preferable to unregulated chaos. And that brings us to the quirky tidbit of the night. Brothels were sometimes run by nuns. Yep, you heard that right. In more than one documented case, women who were formerly cloistered found themselves voluntarily or not managing houses of ill repute. Some of these conversion stories involve corruption, others desperation, and at least one chronicle tells of a convent doubling as a brothel with no one the wiser until the bishop walked in unannounced. Surprise! Of course, sex work wasn't limited to cities. In towns and villages, camp followers provided services to soldiers, while some taverns had private rooms that saw a lot more than beer steins being lifted. Women weren't always victims in these exchanges. Some were business savvy, carving out a degree of independence in a world that offered very few options. But what about young people? Surely, they were chaste little lambs until marriage? Yeah, no. Historians still argue whether medieval youth were significantly more restrained than today's teenagers. There's evidence of premarital sex in peasant communities, where engagements often included a sort of trial period. In some regions, pregnancy was even considered proof of a valid engagement. So long as the couple eventually married, everyone kind of looked the other way. Picture it. You're a young farmhand, freshly scrubbed, well, relatively, and it's midsummer. There's a festival in the village green. Music, ale, dancing, and just enough parental distraction for you to sneak off behind the granary with that flaxen-haired girl from downriver. It's dark, there's laughter, there's breathless whispering. And just like that rules or not, you've joined the unofficial ranks of the sinned but smiling. But not all rendezvous were romantic. Some were transactional, others downright manipulative. Women, especially those without family or protection, were incredibly vulnerable. Consent was a murky area, not even legally defined the way we understand it today. And while there were laws against assault, enforcement was rare, especially if the offender was wealthy or connected. The woman often bore the social cost alone. Still, intimacy found ways to flourish outside the church's playbook. Love tokens rings, cloth pieces, even hair braids were passed secretly. Lovers carved initials into trees, exchanged poems, or met in the woods under the pretense of gathering firewood. The woods, by the way, were basically the medieval equivalent of a cheap motel. Remote, quiet, leafy, and no prying eyes. There were folk remedies and love potions too. You might find a hedge witch who claimed to sell you a root that made someone fall for you or made you irresistible. Some women drank concoctions that supposedly prevented pregnancy, they didn't, or used herbs like pennyroyal and tansy with dangerous side effects. This was before Planned Parenthood, remember. And let's not overlook the wildest rebel of them all, romantic poetry. Courtly love became a whole genre of rebellion disguised as culture. Poets like Chrétien de Troyes or troubadours in southern France spun tales of knights pining for married ladies, a forbidden love conquering cold custom. Sure, it was supposed to be chaste, but between the lines, heat. In fact, some of these poems were so steamy they had to be copied in private, their pages hidden in hollowed-out prayer books. That's right, someone literally carved out a devotional text just to stash their medieval fanfiction. And honestly, respect. But despite all the rebellion, the shame still hung overhead. Many of these acts were whispered, not shouted, risky, not safe, and always wastinged with danger. Because even the most carefree festival kids could spiral into scandal, punishment, or exile. Still, as you close your eyes and imagine a field lit only by moonlight and mischief, You realize the truth. Medieval people weren't robots draped in chainmail. They were messy, passionate, complicated humans, just like you, just like me. And in a world of rigid codes and relentless sermons, sometimes just wanting someone was the most rebellious act of all. The air is heavier now, not just from the candle smoke curling like secrets toward the rafters, but from the unspoken. You shift on your straw mattress, elbow brushing a rough woolen blanket, and you wonder what happened after those stolen moments. What came next when the thrill faded and the church bell tolled again? Tonight, you find yourself wandering through the peculiar rituals of medieval Mariaga. Ceremony, half sacred vow, half awkward livestock trade. Let's set the mood. You're standing in a muddy village square, wearing your best tunic, still smells faintly of goat, while someone's grandmother haggles with your father over the dowry. Welcome to Love, Medieval Edition. Mainstream historical fact: marriage wasn't just a personal decision, it was a social, economic, and sometimes political contract. Especially among the nobility, who treated weddings like military alliances wrapped in flower garlands. But even among peasants, marriage involved more than two people and a bouquet. It was a community affair overseen by family elders, local lords, and, inevitably, the church. Now here comes the strange part. You didn't actually need a priest to get married. Surprise! What you did need was mutual consent, two people declaring, "I take you as mine," often with witnesses. This was called verbum, and it was legally binding. Just a spoken promise, boom, you're hitched. Of course, the church eventually grew twitchy about people getting married behind barns and in alehouses, so it tried to rein things in with official ceremonies, bans, and parish records. But for much of the Middle Ages, handfastinga pre-wedding promise, where couples literally tied their hands together, was still the real deal start of marriage. So yes, you could be married before you even made it to the altar. Awkward if your in-laws didn't get the memo. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some couples consummated their marriage before the official ceremony just to prove it was valid. That's right. Nothing says eternal love like an anxious couple ducking into the woods while Aunt Mildred is still hanging garlands on the pews. It wasn't even considered scandalous, just efficient. Oh, and speaking of efficiency, the bedding ceremony. Picture this. After the vows, your friends and family march you to bed. Literally. They undress you, tuck you in together, and sometimes hang around until things start getting cozy. Some towns even required a witness to confirm the act took place. Can you imagine? Your mother-in-law sipping cider by the hearth while you fumble with a garter. Yeah, romance. Why the fanfare? Because consummation mattered. A lot. A marriage wasn't truly binding until it had been physically sealed. No action, no contract. In some cases, lack of consummation was valid grounds for annulment, and proving it sometimes meant submitting to invasive inspections by church-appointed matrons. Not exactly a spa day. Historians still argue whether these customs were universally enforced or more symbolic in some regions. Some scholars suggest the bedding ceremony was mostly ceremonial by the late Middle Ages, while others believe it was taken deadly seriously, especially when property or legitimacy was at stake. But beneath all the rules and rituals, there were still emotions. Yes, arranged marriages could turn into partnerships, even friendships. Some even blossomed into love. There are letter-surviving scraps of ink and parchment where husbands wrote tenderly to wives, praising their character, their cleverness, even their laughter. One knight in 14th century France called his wife, "My delight, my companion, the quiet of my soul." Take that, Nicholas Sparks. Still, for many, especially women, marriage was less about delight and more about survival. Once married, a woman's legal identity often merged with her husband's blank. She became femme covert, which basically meant she couldn't own property, sue, or make contracts without his say-so. Medieval marriage, now with 100% more legal erasure. But again, people found ways around the rules. Some women managed their husbands' estates while they were off crusading. Some wielded power behind the scenes. Others, like the merchants' wives of London, ran entire businesses, negotiated with suppliers, and kept the books, all while technically being invisible to the law. And if things soured, divorce wasn't an option. Not officially. Annulment was, but only under strict conditions: no consummation, consanguinity, or fraud. Abuse, infidelity, not really valid. Your best hope was a legal separation, which let you live apart but still banned remarriage. Essentially, you go to your side of the village, I'll go to mine, and we'll pretend we're both single in spirit. Of course, some people just walked away, changed villages, assumed new names, reinvented themselves. The medieval world, despite all its records and rituals, had a surprisingly high tolerance for disappearing acts, especially in times of plague, war, or famine, when keeping tabs got tricky. So, as you lie there now, tracing invisible patterns into the scratchy wool blanket, you imagine it. Two people standing under a low oak, hands tied together, wind tangling their hair, while a small crowd cheers and throws stale bread crusts in celebration. No rings, no priest, just the promised and the quiet understanding that they're jumping into the unknown together. Because in the end, medieval marriage wasn't just about land or law. It was about choosing someone to share your chamber pot with for the next 40 winters. And somehow, that feels more intimate than any diamond ring ever could. Now your mind drifts toward the quieter corners of medieval intimacy, those blurry spaces where law and love gave way to whispers, secrets, and silent transgressions. Because as much as the church preached order and purity, there were always those who lived in between the margins. So tonight, you'll light your mental lantern and step softly into the world of forbidden love and clandestine affairs. It starts, of course, with rules. So many rules. Don't covet, don't touch, don't even think about your neighbor's spouse unless you want to burn for eternity. But let's face it, rules were made to be broken, especially when hearts and other parts are involved. Mainstream historical fact: adultery was illegal across most of medieval Europe. In canon law, it was considered a mortal sin. In civil law, it could result in fines, imprisonment, or if you were nobility, disgrace, and political fallout. But let's zoom in on the everyday people. What if you were a bored baker's wife, or a lonely blacksmith with arms like tree trunks and an unfortunate wife who always smelled like onions? Temptation didn't ask for your income level, and enforcement was wildly inconsistent. Sometimes affairs went unnoticed. Other times, entire towns gathered to shame an adulterer by parading them through the streets in nothing but a shift and a crown of nettles. Medieval slut shaming was not subtle. Here's your quirky tidbit for tonight. In some German towns, a guilty couple caught in bed might be nailed inside the house. That's right, locals would literally hammer the door shut so everyone knew what happened. It was less about punishment, more about public embarrassment. Imagine waking up to the sound of hammering and realizing, oops, we're the village headline. But not all forbidden love was scandalous. Some of it was quiet, tender, desperate. Think about married women who fell in love with someone else and not out of lust, but because their arranged marriages were cold as cellar stones. Or clergy members who tried to live celibately but found themselves drawn into deep emotional bonds. These weren't always torrid affairs. Sometimes they were just forbidden glances across pews or stolen letters slipped between books of hours. Historians still argue whether emotional intimacy counted as adultery in the minds of medieval moralists. Some believed anything short of physical contact was forgivable. Others insisted that even thinking about someone else in that way was a crime of the soul. The lines were blurry and very subjective. Nowhere is this blur clearer than in the famous case of Abelard and Heloise. He was a philosopher, she a brilliant young student, their love passionate, defiant, intellectual to a secret child, a disastrous separation, and eventually letters that still echo with heartbreak nearly 1,000 years later. If Romeo and Juliet had a Latin dictionary and matching vowel silence tokens, it'd be them. Or consider the world of same-sex desire, which existed in a strange contradiction. On one hand, the church condemned sodomy as a sin so serious it often went unnamed. On the other, close same-gender friendships were everywhere, and some of them were clearly more than just bro time. Historians still argue whether certain medieval poems, particularly those written by monks or aristocratic women, should be read as romantic, platonic, or something in between. What's clear though is that people found ways to express love in code, in letters, in shared locks of hair, in matching religious medals, in metaphors that danced around meaning like a court jester avoiding eye contact with the bishop. For example, calling someone my dove in winter sounds sweet until you realize doves mated for life and were considered sexually pure. In other words, I see you, I want you, but I'll speak in bird metaphors to survive. And then there were the wandering eyes of the powerful. Kings, nobles, bishops all were technically expected to uphold chastity or fidelity, and all of them, frankly, struggled. King Philip the Fair of France had his knights arrest the lovers of his daughters-in-law in an event that ended with public trials and alleged torture on the rack. Meanwhile, some popes kept mistresses openly, because nothing says spiritual leadership like a side piece and a summer villa. You begin to wonder, were medieval people actually more scandalous than us, or just less protected? After all, there was no Tinder, no text messages, no burner phones. If you wrote your crush a note, it could end up in court. If you met them in the woods, there was a 50/50th chance a shepherd saw the whole thing and told everyone over stew. Yet somehow, love survived. Lovers kissed in secret gardens, married couples fell back in love, forbidden hands found each other beneath communion benches, and behind every rule, there was always a way to bend it, just slightly, in the name of longing. So tonight, as your breath slows and the candle gutters, picture it, a narrow alley, lamplit and hushed. Two figures, cloaked and cautious, meeting for just a few moments of connection before returning to the lives they never chose. No music, no witnesses, just heartbeats echoing like prayers against the stone. Because sometimes, in the quietest corners of history, love didn't shout, it whispered. And now, your mind shifts from forbidden whispers in alleyways to the clatter of cloisters, the incense-soaked chapels, the chants echoing through carved stone, because tonight, you're stepping behind monastery walls to peek into one of the strangest paradoxes of the Middle Ages. How people swore off sex entirely and still somehow couldn't stop thinking about it. Welcome to the sacred, awkward, and deeply human world of celibacy and temptation. Hey, you took a vow. You're not supposed to even look at someone the wrong way, let alone imagine what they might look like without their linen habit. But, well, you're still human. And this is where things start to get weird. Let's start with the mainstream historical fact. By the High Middle Ages, clerical celibacy was the rule. Not always followed, but definitely required. Priests, monks, and nuns were expected to remain sexually abstinent for life. This was supposed to elevate them spiritually, removing distraction and aligning them more closely with the divine. Sounds noble. Sounds peaceful. Sounds like the exact opposite of how it usually played out. Monastic records are full of spiritual panic. There are entire texts written by monks who struggled with impure dreams, wandering thoughts, or worse, those pesky feelings that showed up even when you were just trying to copy psalms in peace. And they wrote about it. A lot. One poor soul confessed to feeling aroused during matins, which, for the record, is a midnight prayer, Yes, this man was being tempted in his sleep-deprived chanting state. That's commitment. Now, for your quirky tidbit of the night. There's a famous tale of a monk so plagued by lustful thoughts that he threw himself into a thorn bush, fully clothed, fortunately. And while the thorns did cool him down, they also left him limping for weeks. Self-flagellation wasn't just symbolic. Some monks actually practiced it to punish or distract themselves from impure thoughts. Not exactly the quiet contemplation lifestyle advertised in the brochure. The weird part, the more you try to suppress the thoughts, the stronger they got. Monasteries often emphasized strict routines, silence, fasting gall in the name of mental purity. But guess what? Historians still argue whether these extreme disciplines actually helped or whether they made temptation worse. Like telling a teenager not to touch the red button and then leaving them alone in a room with nothing but the red button. You've got monks dreaming of women, nuns dreaming of knights, and sometimes monks dreaming of other monks. It happened. In fact, one 12th century abbot warned his brothers not to gaze too long into each other's eyes, which, depending on how you want to read that, either means watch out for bad vibes or you're all dangerously close to starting a medieval boy band. And the dreams weren't the only problem. There were visitors' noblewomen making donations, laborers helping with repairs, local boys delivering food, all of them potential distractions. Some monasteries dealt with this by building high walls, others just looked the other way until scandal erupted. Oh, and then there's the nuns. Everyone forgets the nuns. Women in cloisters were expected to be the brides of Christ, but some of their letters carefully preserved in cloister archives are heartbreakingly honest. One nun wrote about her struggle not to think about her fiancé, whom she left behind when she took the veil. Another speaks of kissing a statue of the Virgin Mary and feeling overwhelmed with emotion. Some letters are coded so heavily you can almost see the ink sweating with guilt and longing. And then there's the miracles. You'd think miracles would be, divine interventions involving glowing lights and holy water. But sometimes they were used to cover up indiscretions. One medieval chronicle tells of a nun who gave birth in secret and claimed it was the result of divine impregnation. Spoiler alert, it was not, but for a while people actually believed her, or pretended to. Because even in cloisters, sometimes the truth was just too uncomfortable. Historians still argue whether the church's rules on celibacy created more holiness or more hypocrisy. Some scholars believe the ideal of celibacy led to remarkable art, devotion, and discipline. Others point to the scandalous pregnancies, affairs, hidden children and ask, what's the cost of pretending people aren't human? And to be fair, not everyone struggled. Some monks and nuns lived peaceful, genuinely celibate lives. They found solace in prayer, fulfillment in work, and joy in community. But even they weren't immune to the occasional strange dream or awkward passing thought, because you can wall off the world, but you can't really wall off your brain. Now picture it, a quiet scriptorium. The air smells like old parchment and beeswax. You sit hunched over a manuscript, quill in hand, when the brother next to you coughs. You glance up. And in that tiny, innocent moment, a spark flickers. Not lust necessarily, maybe just curiosity. And suddenly, you're not thinking about God anymore. You're thinking about him. About his hands, about his voice during morning chants. And then you shake it off, mutter a prayer, stab your quill too hard into the ink pot, and try again. That was the paradox of medieval celibacy. Not the absence of desire, but the constant wrestling match with it. And not just physical desire, but emotional craving connection, intimacy, the ache of loneliness in the middle of a stone-cold cell. So tonight, as your room quiets and you drift toward dreams, picture yourself in candlelight, robe wrapped tight, trying to copy a page of Psalms while your thoughts scatter like sparrows through the rafters. And maybe, just maybe, you smile, because even the purest monk had trouble staying focused sometimes. And honestly, same. The candle flickers. The walls of the monastery fade behind you, and now your thoughts drift to places even quieter, even more shadowy, where shame, secrecy, and society's harshest judgments lived. Tonight, you're slipping into a world rarely recorded, often condemned, and still fiercely debated. The hidden lives of queer people in the medieval world. No rainbow flags, no parades, just silence, careful glances, words rewritten to mean something else entirely. And yet, even here, in a time wrapped tight in religious rules and social norms, queer lives still existed, still burned quietly beneath the surface. Let's start with a mainstream historical fact. The medieval church formally condemned all non-procreative sex as sinful. That included same-sex activity. In fact, the word sodomy became a kind of catch-all term for any sexual act not aimed at reproduction. You could be fined, excommunicated, even executed depending on your status and who you happen to anger. But the enforcement was inconsistent, and the reality, messier, more human. Men wrote poems to men. Women formed deep emotional bonds that blurred every possible line. Monks shared cells and sometimes their dreams. And in the courts of Europe, aristocrats whispered rumors of dukes and courtiers with tastes that dared to veer from the expected. Some of those whispers were malicious, others probably true. Take the story of Richard the Lionheart. Warrior king, crusader, legendary figure. Rumors of his relationships with men have echoed through the centuries. Historians still argue whether his bond with King Philip II of France was romantic or simply political, but the language used in some chronicles, sharing a bed, constant companionship, tearful partings, makes the imagination twitch. Is it conclusive? Number. But it leaves a door ajar. Or consider the nuns who exchanged letters, real ones, preserved in dusty archives. In these, you'll find phrases like, "My soul burns for you," and "I carry your kiss like a secret relic." These weren't just sisterly, at least not in the 21st century sense. Still, were they lovers? Was this just religious fervor taken poetically? Again, historians still argue whether to read these as queer longing or deeply emotional platonic affection. The truth is, medieval people didn't have our language. No labels like gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans. Their concepts of gender and sexuality were fluid in different ways and sometimes more restrictive, other times oddly flexible. In some rural areas, people just shrugged at things they didn't understand. In others, they sharpened their pitchforks. But let's take a pause here for a quirky tidbit. In 14th century France, there was a case of a woman who lived as a man for decades, serving as a soldier, marrying a woman, and working as a blacksmith. When finally discovered, she claimed she had been granted special permission from God. While the church did not buy it, many of her neighbors reportedly defended her. Which means, even in a time of fire and brimstone, a little bit of mind your business energy managed to survive. Now imagine this. You're a young person in a medieval village. You feel different. You're drawn to your best friend in ways you can't explain. There are no books to help, no one to talk to. You whisper your secrets to the wind while watching the sheep. Maybe you pretend. Maybe you marry, as expected. Maybe you don't. But still, your heart keeps tugging you sideways. You're not alone. In the courts of Europe, there were men who lived almost openly with their favorites. King Edward II of England caused endless scandal with his close relationship to peers, Gaveston lavishing him with gifts, titles, and even rooms next to the royal chamber. Eventually, this favoritism got peers killed, brutally, but Edward kept mourning him, loudly, passionately, in public. Historians still argue whether their relationship was sexual. but few deny it was intense and emotional and far outside the bounds of expected royal decorum. Even in religious spaces, desire sometimes broke through the veil of obedience. There are surviving confessions from monks who struggled with feelings toward other brothers. Some repented, others didn't. And the church, often unsure how to handle it, fluctuated between harsh punishment and quiet transfers to other monasteries, because who wants that kind of gossip at Sunday Mass? But not all queer life was tragedy. Some of it was tender, funny, subtle. Imagine two women pretending to be inseparable best friends for years, sharing a home, growing old together, and surviving by weaving or healing or brewing. The village might gossip, or not, but as long as they kept to themselves and paid their tithes, many communities quietly let it be. There are records of women buried side by side under matching headstone necessitors. Maybe. Lovers. Possibly. No one said, but someone remembered. You start to see it. Medieval queerness wasn't a parade. It was a dance in shadows. A message scrawled in the margins of a psalter. A pressed flower hidden in a drawer. A glance held a second too long. And yes, sometimes it was dangerous. Lives were ruined. Accusations flew. Inquisition records include painful stories of people tortured for their desires. In Florence, men caught in same-sex relationships were fined, whipped, or worse. And yet, many continued anyway, meeting in alleys, writing poems, slipping through the cracks. You feel a strange ache as you drift through this world. So much loneliness, but also so much courage and creativity. And love, sometimes tragic, sometimes defiant, sometimes joyful in the quietest ways. So tonight, as you tuck yourself in and let the soft hum of the night settle, remember this. Medieval history wasn't just kings and battles. It was also secret smiles, touches never written down. Love that dared to exist anyway. Because even when no one had the words, the feelings were still there. Now you exhale, slow and steady, and the candle gutters low again. The weight of silence lifts as your mind drifts from secret glances to something more structured, less forbidden, more official, but no less fascinating. You're headed into the formal world of marriage and bedroom expectations in the Middle Ages, and yes, it's just as gloriously awkward as you might guess. Here's the thing. You don't marry for love. That's adorable, and sometimes it accidentally happens, but most of the time, you marry for property, for alliances, for social standing. You're a pawn in your parents' chess game, and you're expected to smile through the whole thing, even if you're 13 and your new spouse has a beard and back problems. Let's lock in a mainstream historical fact. In medieval Christian Europe, marriage was considered a sacrament sacred, indissoluble, and, theoretically, a reflection of divine union. Once you said, "I do," that was it. Divorce was nearly impossible unless someone died or the Pope signed off on an annulment. You'd better hope your new spouse had good table manners. And yes, sex was absolutely expected. In fact, you were supposed to consummate the marriage as soon as possible to make it valid. That's not just romantic, it was legal. So legal that if someone tried to claim they weren't really married, the church could ask for evidence. Sometimes, disturbingly, even witnesses. In some royal cases, you'd have nobles standing outside your wedding chamber, waiting for the celebratory shout, or the bedsheet. Now breathe, because your quirky tidbit is about to appear. In some German territories, there were literal bed inspectors. These were women, often older, often nosy, who would come in to prepare the bridal, bed-checking linens, fluffing pillows, and occasionally staying close enough to make sure things went well. Imagine being the poor couple trying to have their first night while Aunt Bertha, the professional towel folder, hovers 2 feet away, blessing the mattress. Of course, it wasn't all straight-laced. The church might have pushed for piety, But people still found loopholes. There were marriages of conscience, performed secretly, often just by saying the right vows to each other without witnesses. These created chaos when one party later denied either, when multiple secret marriages turned up like bad pennies. Historians still argue whether the church's grip on marriage helped stabilize society or just buried people alive in bad matches. On one hand, it kept things tidy: inheritances, family lines, legitimacy. On the other, a lot of people spent decades sleeping next to someone they barely liked. And about the actual act in the bedroom, well, get ready for the least steamy pillow talk of your life. Sex wasn't just a physical act, it was supposed to be functional. Procreation, period. You weren't supposed to enjoy it too much. In fact, getting too enthusiastic was frowned upon. Many theologians, Augustine, were looking at you believed that pleasure distracted from the divine purpose. That didn't stop people, of course, but it did lead to hilariously specific church-approved guidelines. Missionary position? Okay. Anything else? Risky? Daytime? Suspicious? Sundays? Forbidden? During Lent? Are you trying to get smoked? There were literal manuals about this. Some even included charts. But let's zoom in. You are a newly married peasant. Your bed is a straw-filled sack. Your privacy is non-existent. And your spouse is probably exhausted from a day of threshing barley. You whisper goodnight, awkwardly shuffle closer, and try not to poke anyone with your belt buckle. Maybe it's sweet. Maybe it's weird. Maybe it's over in 2 minutes and followed by a discussion about chicken feed. In wealthier households, it's fancy embroidered sheets, perfumed oils, servants giggling behind doors, but no less complicated. A noble bride might have no idea what's expected. A noble groom might be drunk. And both are probably wondering if they can just skip to the part with the banquet leftovers. Still, some couples did love each other. There are letters, beautiful ones, from husbands to wives expressing longing, affection, even desire. And some marriages, arranged or not, turned into genuine partnerships. They raised children, ran estates, laughed together, and yes, probably made fun of the bishop behind his back. And some couples just faked it. There are stories of nobles who quietly lived separate lives, with separate bedrooms and very different evening plans. Some had long-term affairs. Others found creative ways to avoid producing heirs, much to the horror of the church. Historians still argue whether methods like coitus interruptus were secretly more common than records admit. Then, of course, there's the issue of consent, a darker corner of medieval marriage. Legally, a husband had rights to his wife's body. If she refused him, he could take it as a form of disobedience, something theologians occasionally tried to nuance, but rarely did well. It wasn't just awkward, it was dangerous. Some women used religious devotion as a shield, claiming holy illness, or retreating into spiritual life to escape the demands of the marriage bed. Others found strength in numbers. Female communities in towns' widows, spinsters, nuns often supported one another and traded secrets about herbs that could delay conception or ease discomfort. The medieval version of a group chat. No emojis, but plenty of sass. So here you are, lying back on a creaky bed stuffed with hay, under scratchy linen, with the faint sound of chickens through the window. Your new spouse is snoring beside you. Somewhere, a dog is barking at the moon. And you realize this is it. Marriage, medieval style. A strange dance of duty, awkwardness, and occasional tenderness. It wasn't all doom and repression. People joked, flirted, shared moments of affection. They navigated the bizarre expectations of religion, society, and personal longing with as much grace as they could. Because in the end, love isn't always fireworks. Sometimes it's just holding hands under a wool blanket while the wind howls outside. The straw mattress rustles softly beneath you, and your mind, already so far from your own century, drifts once again. Only now you're shifting from the narrow boundaries of marriage to the broad, sometimes chaotic carnival of sex work, desire, and public indulgence in medieval towns. Because while the church preached chastity from the pulpit down in the taverns and alleyways, it was a very different sermon. You can smell the ale before you hear the laughter. Someone spills cider on the wooden floor. A lute player plucks out a sloppy tune in the corner. And over by the long table near the fire, a woman with kohl-rimmed eyes and a too-knowing smile raises her mug in your direction. You've wandered into a brothel, but don't panic, this is a history tour. Let's start with your mainstream historical fact. Prostitution was widespread and, surprisingly, often regulated. In cities like London, Paris, and Florence, brothels operated under municipal oversight. That's right, local governments licensed them, taxed them, and even inspected them. Why? Because as long as it stayed controlled, the logic went, it helped prevent greater moral chaos. A bishop might thunder about sin on Sunday morning, but the mayor knew the city needed its release valve open by Sunday night. Some towns even designated entire red light districts, complete with signs. In Southwark, just across the river from London proper, stews, the polite term for bathhouses cum brothels, openly advertised their services. The women, often poor, often with few other options, became fixtures of the local economy. They were also deeply vulnerable, often at the mercy of clients, landlords, and corrupt officials. And yet, here comes your quirky tidbit. In some medieval cities, sex workers wore distinctive clothing, often yellow hoods or a striped dressesto signaled their trade. It was meant to shame them. But sometimes, they leaned into it, turning regulation into fashion. Imagine turning your badge of disgrace into a runway moment. Now you might ask, wasn't this all illegal under church doctrine? Yes. And also, not really. The church condemned fornication, but many clerics quietly accepted its inevitability. Thomas Aquinas. That Thomas Aquinas compared prostitution to a sewer in a palace. Disgusting, sure, but remove it and the whole place overflows. Not exactly a glowing review, but a revealing metaphor. Historians still argue whether the toleration of sex work was driven more by pragmatism or pure hypocrisy. Either way, brothels operated openly for centuries, often within walking distance of cathedrals. And what about the workers themselves? They weren't all helpless victims, though many suffered. Some ran their own establishments. Others formed mutual support circles, like the women in 14th century Avignon who pooled money to cover burial expenses. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival, and sometimes companionship. You might even find love stories in strange corners, tales of knights who fell for fallen women, renounced their swords, and opened a tavern together. Probably apocryphal, but cute. Now imagine this. You're in a bustling tavern in Bruges, 1362. It's Friday night, and your boots stick to the floor. You hear 3 languages in one sentence: Dutch, French, a little Latin just to impress the barmaid. In the shadows near the hearth, 2 women flirt. A merchant slips coins into a musician's hand. And in the corner booth, a brothel keeper negotiates loudly with a city clerk about next month's taxes. Business as usual, but not all sex work happened indoors. In many towns, women stood at designated corners, sometimes near churches, ironically, and called out to passers-by. In some cities, laws prohibited them from working during holy days. In others, they simply paid extra fines to cover the sin tax. And here's the kicker. Despite public condemnation, some brothels became popular, like really popular. Pilgrims heading to holy sites often made a detour for the nearest bathhouse. Clergy got caught ministering to women with suspiciously little clothing. And in one infamous case, a bishop was found in a brothel he later claimed he had entered to preach repentance. Sure, buddy. Still, not everyone approved. Reform movements like the Beguines and Lollards pushed for crackdowns. Some towns shuttered brothels. only to reopen them quietly later when crime surged. Because, like that sewer metaphor, it all came back to control. As long as the city could tax, monitor, and confine the behavior, it was easier to stomach. And this wasn't limited to women. Male sex workers, while less discussed in records, absolutely existed, especially in port cities and larger towns. Their clientele ranged from lonely widows to closeted aristocrats to visiting sailors. Historians still argue whether some medieval guilds turned a blind eye to members moonlighting in more risque professions. Of course, there were real risks. Disease, violence, and legal penalties loomed constantly. Some women were whipped in public. Others were branded or exiled. And yet, the profession endured for centuries. Why? Because poverty doesn't leave many options, and because desire never goes away. Some workers did find ways out. Marriage, inheritance, religious, conversion, some stories ended well, others not so much. But all of them, even the forgotten ones, remind us that medieval life wasn't just about chivalry and prayers. It was also messy, sweaty, human. And so, here you lie again, eyes half closed, as the tavern fades around you. The music softens, the candle gutters. You've seen desire dressed in velvet and dirt, whispered behind veils and shouted across alleyways. And suddenly, the moral rigidity of the era seems more like a mask than a mirror. Because even under stone cathedrals and starched doctrine, people still reached out for warmth, for pleasure, for someone to say their name softly in the dark. And if that isn't timeless, what is? The tavern's hum dissolves behind you like foam slipping from a mug. You exhale, shifting your mind again deeper this time. The flickering torchlight and the bustle of cities give way to something older, colder, and far more powerful. Tonight, you drift into the world of the church's control over sexual morality, a system so intricate and intimidating it could make a confessional feel like a courtroom. Let's get one thing straight. You're not in charge of your own body anymore. Not really. Not if you believe what the sermons say, and most people afraid of damnation and fond of not being set on fire for heresy very much did. Sex wasn't private. It was policed, spiritualized, and weaponized. Every bedroom had an invisible guest, the church. Your mainstream historical fact hits first. By the High Middle Ages, the Catholic Church has successfully defined the boundaries of acceptable sexual behavior for nearly all of Western Europe. And let's just say those boundaries were tight. You could only have sex within marriage for procreation, in the missionary position, at night, in silence, on non-holy days. Possibly while thinking about penance. You feel claustrophobic yet? To enforce this, the church had systems, elaborate ones. Monks wrote manuals, thick ones detailing every possible sin and its punishment. You could flip to the right page and find out how many Hail Marys you owed for kissing your betrothed with unseasonable passion. There were even penances for thinking about sex too often, or with the wrong person, or while baking bread. Yes, that's a real thing. And then there was the confessional. Introduced more widely in the 13th century, it became the holy spreadsheet of your soul. Priests kept mental track of your sins, and if they were nosy, and they often were, they'd ask specific questions. How many times? With whom? In what position? Were you kneeling for prayer? You'd better believe some priests got way too into the details. Historians still argue whether this confessional curiosity helped people reflect, or just created a dark little window into everyone's fantasies. And yet, people complied, not always out of devotion, often out of fear. The threat of eternal damnation wasn't subtle, neither were the sermons. You'd sit in a cold stone church, listening to the village priest thunder about lust while barn swallows nested in the rafters above you. Meanwhile, your neighbor 3 pews down is wearing that new cloak and looking mighty fine. Now comes your quirky tidbit. In some medieval penitential handbooks, There are entries for what to do if someone has intercourse with a demon in a dream. That's right, demonic dream sex. The punishment? Fasting, prayer, and not sleeping on your back for a while. So, yes, even your subconscious was under surveillance. And we haven't even gotten to the list. Oh, the glorious, terrifying list. There were forbidden days. Advent, Lent, Ember Days, Saints' Days, Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, the eve of major feasts. If you added it all up, that left maybe half the year as acceptable for marital intimacy. Maybe. And even then, you were expected to behave like a monk with a mild headache. The result? A tangled mess of guilt, secrecy, and ritual. Couples either learned to navigate the restrictions like seasoned bureaucrats, or just ignored them and hoped St. Peter wasn't watching that night. And outside of marriage, a minefield. Adultery was a major sin, with severe consequences, public shaming, exile, and sometimes worse. But again, enforcement was spotty. Nobles often got away with it, especially if they made generous donations. A little gold in the offering plate, and the church might squint a little less hard at your cousin who conveniently lives in your tower. For peasants, it was riskier. A woman caught with a lover might be paraded through the streets, hair cut short, clothes ripped. A man might be flogged or quietly bribed to leave town. The records are full of contradictions. Mercy here, cruelty there. It all depended on who you were and how badly the priest needed a new roof. And yet, people still found ways. Lovers met in barns, in stables, behind hedges. They whispered in coded language. They passed notes, yes, actual notes, even among the illiterate, sometimes drawn with symbols. Secret rendezvous weren't just for nobles with balconies. Some took even greater risks. They joined heretical sects like the Cathars, who openly rejected the church's sexual rules. The Cathars believed the flesh was evil, so the best sex was no sex. But ironically, their very rejection of church authority made them attractive to those sick of all the rules. Historians still argue whether sexual repression helped fuel these radical movements. Meanwhile, monasteries and nunneries became places of both abstinence and, let's be honest, occasional scandal. Letters and court cases reveal monks sneaking out, nuns becoming pregnant, abbots turning a blind eye. Desire doesn't vanish behind stone walls. It just hides better. And then, the Inquisition. Yes, that Inquisition. While often focused on heresy, they didn't shy away from investigating deviant acts, whispers of illicit affairs, unnatural behaviors, and secret midnight gatherings were sometimes enough to summon a tribunal. People confessed things they never did under pressure, fear, or the occasional flame. But here's the twist. Not every priest was approved. Some offered quiet absolution. Some gave advice. Some even helped lovers marry in secret. The church wasn't a monolith. It was full of contradictions, human failings, quiet kindnesses, and loud hypocrisies. And so, you lie in your bed, half listening to the wind, rattling the shutters, thinking about the strange grip the church had over everyone's private urges. About how it tried to bottle desire like holy water, and how often that bottle cracked. Because even under centuries of doctrine, people still whispered, still touched, still snuck out on moonless nights. Because control is powerful, but longing is older than Rome. The candles in the cathedral flicker out behind you, and once again you slip into the night, deeper into the world where rules, robes, and rituals met raw human longing. But tonight, you're not lingering in the pews. You're going further off the record. Because now it's time to peek inside the peculiar and often contradictory views of sexuality in monastic life, the lives of monks and nuns who, supposedly, had left it all behind. You awaken to cold stone under your feet, the scent of incense barely masking something more: organic damp robes, candle wax, parchment. You're in a cloister. The abbey bells toll faintly. And outside your little cell, a figure moves in silence. It's Brother Thomas, up early to recite the hours. Or perhaps sneaking toward the herb garden for reasons unspoken. You've entered a paradox, a life devoted to purity, yet endlessly distracted by the flesh. Let's kick off with your mainstream historical fact. Monks and nuns took vows of chastity as part of their religious commitment. This wasn't symbolic. It meant total abstention forever. No glances, no hand-holding, no accidental shoulder brushes in the cloister corridor. In theory, anyway. Monastic rules were strict. Most abbeys had codes like the Rule of St. Benedict that laid out everything from how to sleep to how to speak, hint, rarely. The idea was to remove temptation by structuring every moment of the day. Wake, pray, eat, pray, copy manuscripts, pray again, sleep on a wooden plank, repeat until you ascend. But here comes the quirky tidbit. Despite all this solemn order, medieval monasteries were also hotbeds of gossip and sometimes scandal. One nun in 14th century Italy reportedly kept a lover hidden in a wine barrel. He stayed there for months, slipping out only at night. That's devotion of a very different kind. It wasn't always so clandestine either. Letters, court records, and even papal inquiries document monks fathering children, nuns exchanging love poems, and abbots turning abbeys into private fiefdoms. In one case, an entire convent was found to be hosting regular masquerade parties, because even God's servants apparently enjoyed a little drama. Historians still argue whether monastic life was more sexually repressed or simply more creatively managed. After all, the pressure to suppress something as primal as desire often made it mutate. Dreams, visions, ecstatic experience, sometimes interpreted as holy encounters, may have masked more human urges. Saint Teresa's famously sensual visions of angels, for example, have sparked debates for centuries. Was it mysticism or something a little more Freudian? And let's not forget the demons. No, really. Many monks and nuns reported nightly assaults by incubi and succubi, supernatural beings said to provoke lust and steal energy. The church took these reports seriously. Victims were encouraged to confess, fast, and in some cases, sleep with protective amulets. If you're wondering why medieval dream life involved so much combat, now you know. There was a practical side to all this too. Some abbeys separated men and women by great distances, others had connecting tunnels. You can probably guess how that worked out. Take the Abbey of Fontevraud in France, famously governed by abbesses who ruled both male and female houses. In theory, perfect order. In practice, regular complaints about fraternization, particularly during festivals and joint meals. Apparently, even spiritual discipline can fray under the right lighting and a little mulled wine. And yet, many monks and nuns did remain celibate, or try their absolute best. There are records of self-flagellation, vows of silence, and isolation chambers designed to suppress temptation. Some spent entire lifetimes resisting with quiet dignity. Others carved slightly too detailed marginalia of rabbits and oddly shaped vegetables into the pages of sacred text. Which reminds me, monks had a lot of time with quills and ink, so yes, naughty doodles in the margins of holy manuscripts weren't uncommon. You've probably seen some of the ones with snails fighting knights or monkeys playing lutes, but buried among the silliness are hints of frustrated libido, a friar with a bulging codpiece, a nun kissing a fox and a cow, visual whispers. Meanwhile, public perception was equally mixed. Monks were respected but also mocked in bawdy songs and plays. One popular Middle English tale involves a lusty friar and a farmer's wife who teaches him a very graphic lesson about consent. The joke? Everyone in the village knows it's based on someone real. And those who did get caught, punishments varied. Some were defrocked, others exiled. A few were simply moved to more remote monasteries. away from temptation, or at least, away from eyewitnesses. The church preferred discretion when possible. Scandal in the press, or, well, in the pulpit, was bad for business. Yet, even among all the chaos, there was a deep yearning for connection. Some monastic communities developed intense spiritual friendships, sometimes between monks, sometimes between nuns, sometimes across gender lines. They wrote letters filled with affection, shared dreams, and comforted each other during dark nights of the soul. Were they romantic, platonic, somewhere in between? Historians still argue whether these bonds were emotional safety valves or coded expressions of love. Either way, they remind us that even in silence, hearts can whisper. You exhale again, imagining a nun tracing a line of ink across a page in the scriptorium. Her hand is steady, but her mind flickers. Maybe she's thinking about last night's vision, or a face from before the veil, or a dream that won't quite fade by morning. Because underneath the layers of habit, hood, and holy vow, the body remains. And desire, ever patient, always waits for the quietest moment to rise. You drift down dim cloisters and rise in the candlelit halls again. But this time, your journey takes you beyond abbeys and hearthstone, the shadowy, sometimes theatrical world of public punishment and shame for sexual misconduct. The kind that made neighbors whisper, children snicker, and church bells clang for reasons not at all spiritual. The wind tonight tastes of smoke and ash, and the soft murmur of villagers gathering in a square, curious, judgmental, maybe a little too eager. Because let's be real, Scandal was the medieval equivalent of Netflix. And when it involved sex, even better. Let's lay down your mainstream historical fact. Public shaming was a widely used form of punishment across medieval Europe, particularly for crimes involving sexuality, adultery, fornication, prostitution, sodomy, and even lewd dancing. That's right. Shake your hips at the wrong saint's festival and suddenly you're on a platform in a burlap sack. Punishments were designed for maximum visibility and maximum humiliation. Stocks and pillories weren't just medieval props, they were real. If you committed a sexual offense, you might find yourself with your head and hands locked in place, left to endure rotten vegetables, sharp words, and the occasional goat nibbling your cloak. You'd be displayed like an unfortunate meat pie at a summer fair. But here comes your quirky tidbit. In parts of medieval Germany, adulterous women were sometimes paraded through the streets riding a donkey backward. Symbolic shame, apparently. And if her lover was identified, he might be forced to wear a ridiculous hat or even carry a sign describing the act. You haven't really suffered until you've done a walk of shame wearing a sandwich board that says "Knave of Sinful Lust." The purpose was moral correction, sure, but also performance. These events were deliberate theater, meant to reinforce social norms. They were noisy, messy, and often cruel. Children would chant songs. Adults might throw dung. Clergy would shout sermons from wooden platforms. It was community control dressed as penance. And oh, did the church approve. This wasn't just mob justice, it was sanctified humiliation. Canon law and civil law overlapped here. Confessors might assign public penance, like walking barefoot to a pilgrimage site or standing at mass in a white shift, exposed and alone, as the congregation pretended not to enjoy the spectacle. But don't be fooled into thinking everyone suffered equally. A noble caught in scandal, maybe a donation, a quiet marriage, a little exile to their country manor, a poor woman accused of fornication, probably barefoot in the mud by sunrise. Historians still argue whether these punishments were driven more by piety or power, because the same acts earned wildly different outcomes depending on status and gender. And then there were the masks. Yes, masks. In some regions, shame masks were crafted out of iron or leather, designed to mock specific offenses. A gossiper might wear one shaped like an animal with a long tongue. A woman accused of sexual impropriety might be given a mask with exaggerated lips or horns. Some had bells attached, just in case you weren't humiliated enough by being a literal jingle joke on legs. Meanwhile, the town crier kept things spicy by shouting out details. Not just who, but how. If two lovers were caught in the barn, the exact angle might be included in the public record. Seriously, medieval people didn't always have privacy, but they definitely had flair. And yet, these punishments weren't always about guilt. False accusations happened. Jealousy, revenge, or a badly timed misunderstanding could land you in the center of the square, defending your virtue while someone you barely knew swore otherwise. In some cases, a woman refusing a suitor could be accused of improper conduct just to ruin her chances elsewhere. That's when ordeal-style trials came in. You'd swear your innocence before God and then endure something borderline absurd. Holding a red-hot iron bar, maybe, or retrieving a stone from boiling water. If your wounds healed cleanly, it meant divine approval. If not, welp, better luck in the afterlife. One chilling example, the ordeal of cold water. The accused, usually suspected of witchcraft or sexual deviance, was bound and tossed into a river. If they sank, they were innocent and, drowning. If they floated, they were guilty. Congratulations, you're evil and buoyant. By now you're wondering, were there any safe spaces? Any reprieves? Yes, but they were fleeting. Occasionally, community leaders would intervene. A kindly priest might plead for leniency. A clever peasant might pay off the right person. Some towns even had a rotating roster of public shaming, like a civic calendar. Ah, yes, Tuesday is fornication. Thursday's the ale tax cheats. Friday, we burn that weird hedge witch. But mostly, it was a performance, designed to control through fear. Yet, here's the twist. Sometimes shame became resistance. People laughed, joked, turned punishment into parody. A man in Paris once turned up to his own public shaming in costume, doing a little jig on the platform. He was arrested again, obviously, but the crowd loved it. Historians still argue whether these acts of defiance planted seeds of rebellion or just gave the audience a better show. And perhaps most fascinating, some towns started to professionalize shame. By the late Middle Ages, certain roles like the shame drummer became official. His job? Beat a rhythm behind you while you paraded through town in disgrace. Imagine your worst mistake choreographed to a low-budget percussion solo. That's real. You sigh, imagining the echoes of drums, the crunch of straw under your feet, the itching embarrassment as your name becomes public property, and yet, somehow, you survive. People always do. Because shame is a weapon, but also a stage. And like any stage, the story can shift depending on who's holding the script. The crowd disperses. The drummer falls silent. But you linger a moment longer, shoes muddy from that imaginary pillory platform, wondering what happens when punishment ends but rumors don't. Because tonight, you're drifting into the realm of myths, legends, and taboo stories that blurred fact and fiction in medieval minds. You're back at the hearth now, not in a castle or a cathedral, but in a crooked old inn, all wood smoke and spilled ale. A woman in a rough wool cloak leans in, eyes glinting with gossip. Behind her, someone's carving initials into the bench. This is where stories start, or twist, or unravel. Let's open with your mainstream historical fact. Storytelling in the Middle Ages was a primary form of entertainment and a method of moral instruction. But when it came to sex, stories quickly slipped into wild territory. From bawdy folktales to hagiographies of saints who somehow remained pure after extended naked torture, sure, medieval people had a thriving, sometimes very unfiltered imagination. And here's your quirky tidbit. One popular medieval legend told of a knight who made a vow of chastity, only to be seduced by a talking tree. Yes, a tree. with eyes, a mouth, and a surprisingly sassy tone. The moral? Nature is seductive and vows are tricky when bark starts flirting with you. This tale was likely an allegory for temptation, but people loved it. It shows up in manuscripts, oral traditions, and possibly one very confused woodcutter's diary. Now let's get to the spicy stuff. Stories about incestuous queens, lusty demons, and pious virgins who fought off entire invading armies using only their prayers and strategically flung chastity belts. You might think these were fringe material, but know some of them were copied and recopied by monks in scriptoriums who added a few giggling marginal notes just for good measure. Historians still argue whether these tales were seen as cautionary, titillating, or just cathartic fantasies. Because while some stories ended in grim warnings, he sinned, he burned, the end, others let their characters get away with all kinds of mischief, sometimes rewarded by angels for being clever. In that ambiguity, it tells you something very real about medieval attitudes. Curiosity and guilt walked hand in hand. Consider the Decameron, a 14th century Italian classic where noble youths flee the plague and tell each other scandalous tales of nuns hiding lovers in wine barrels, again with the barrels, priests losing their robes mid-tryst, and women who used confession like a dating service. These weren't just stories, they were cultural release valves, helping people laugh through rigid systems and unspeakable fears. And then there's the granddaddy of all legends, Pope Joan. Yep, a tale that gripped Europe for centuries about a woman who disguised herself as a man, rose through church ranks, became pope, and was only exposed after giving birth during a procession. Is it true? Probably not. But the legend took hold like wildfire. Historians still argue whether it emerged as anti-papal propaganda, an early feminist parable, or simply a really juicy tale with robes and betrayal. People didn't just tell these stories, they illustrated them. Manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries are filled with images that mix religious iconography with odd little nods to these tales. A saint fighting a demon with suspiciously muscular thighs, a bishop wagging a finger at a couple mid-coitus, while a cat in the margin looks very unimpressed. And let's not forget the animal allegories. Foxes, lions, rabbits, they all play roles in moral fables that somehow always ended in suggestive jokes. Like the famous story of Reynard the Fox, who manipulates clergy, seduces noble women, and generally acts like a medieval Bugs Bunny with fewer scruples. The lesson, maybe don't trust foxes. Or maybe don't trust anybody in a tunic. Here's the thing. These tales, no matter how outrageous, function like cultural mirrors. You'd laugh at the lusty friar, but also maybe look sideways at the real one. You'd hear about the queen's secret lover in the tower and suddenly pay more attention to who's walking where during feast days. And while many of these stories were exaggerated, they always contain a little grain of truth or suspicion. Even saints weren't safe. Some hagiographies contain descriptions so emotionally and physically intense, you'd think they were auditioning for a romance novel. A saint pierced by divine arrows, moaning in blissful agony. That's not just poeticist, straight up euphemism city. And yes, theologians noticed. Some tried to tone things down. Others leaned in harder. Because, confession time, even moralists knew that sex sells, whether in warnings or indulgences. Then there were the superstitions. A woman who ate too many leeks might bear twins. A man who dreamed of fish was doomed to infidelity. If your husband's shadow touched another woman on feast day, well, better light a candle and sharpen your suspicions. Superstitions about sex bled into daily life, becoming rules whispered in kitchens and shouted at festivals. If you think the internet invented relationship paranoia, think again. And speaking of kitchens, did you know that garlic was believed to inflame desire? Some even smeared it on doorposts to lure lovers. Practical? Dubious? Smelly? Absolutely. But who's to say it didn't work now and then? Historians still argue whether these tales and traditions shaped medieval sexuality or merely reflected it. But here's what you can be sure of. People told stories because they needed to process, to joke, to warn, and sometimes to wish. When life is uncertain, and love even more so, stories become a kind of spell, a safe place to flirt with danger. So here you are, mug of cider in hand, leaning close to hear the next whispered legend. Maybe it's about the blacksmith's daughter and the cursed belt, or the wandering knight with the cursed codpiece. Either way, the embers glow, the tale wins on, and you realize sometimes truth wears a mask not to deceive, but to survive. Because stories are how people touch each other across fear, across time, across the unspeakable. And so the fire burns lower. The innkeeper snores in the corner. But you're not done. Because tonight's final tale winds its way into the soft candlelight of a medieval bedroom. You're stepping into the rituals, privacy, or lack of it, and awkward logistics of actual medieval lovemaking, from creaky bed frames to church-sanctioned instruction manuals. First, let's dim expectations. Whatever romantic visions you've conjured, silk sheets, rose petals, and ambient loop music, just drop those off a castle wall. Now replace them with straw-stuffed mattresses, a chilly draft, and the nagging presence of livestock somewhere too nearby for comfort. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Most medieval couples shared communal spaces with extended family. Privacy, as we understand it today, was a luxury of the elite. So actual intimacy? It happened quietly, often hurriedly, sometimes behind hanging fabric or inside tiny sleeping alcoves. It was more functional than flirtatious. You did your best. You hoped the neighbors were asleep, and if you lived in a one-room house, odds are they weren't. Still, that didn't stop people from trying to make it special. Some medieval beds had canopies or bed curtains, not just to block out drafts, but to create a sense of cocoon separation. And if you were lucky, you'd have a few minutes of warmth, maybe even affection, before dawn came and your mother-in-law started clanging pans next door. Now here's your quirky tidbit. In certain regions of France and Italy, lovers believed placing rosemary or mint under the bed would improve fertility and keep bad spirits away. Superstition meant mood lighting. Honestly, we've all lit a weird candle hoping for better results. They just used herbs and crossed their fingers that a demon wouldn't show up. What about, instructions? Oh yes, the church actually offered surprisingly specific guidelines. There were officially sanctioned positions, basically, ones that looked respectable from heaven's perspective. Anything too creative or joyful was frowned upon. The missionary position was preferred. Side by side, suspicious. Standing up, positively heretical. From behind, don't even think about it unless you're reenacting the fall of man, which frankly you might be. Historians still argue whether these rules were consistently enforced or widely ignored. Confessional records suggest a mix of anxiety, confusion, and quiet rebellion. Some people followed the guidelines out of fear. Others confessed after the fact, guiltily but with a shrug. Human nature, after all, doesn't always read the fine print. And there were manuals. Enter the Speculum Doctrinale, De Secretis Mulierum, and other medieval how-to guides that were half theology, half awkward anatomy charts. Monks copied them, physicians referenced them, some even included diagrams, bad ones, but you work with what you've got. One popular idea, that too much pleasure, especially for women, was dangerous. It could overheat the body, cause fainting, in rare cases, spontaneous combustion. Not really, but close. So women were advised to remain modest, subdued, and grateful not giddy. Of course, this didn't stop real people from experimenting. Courtiers passed notes, peasants exchanged tips, and somewhere in a Welsh village, Someone probably invented a new position and never got credit for it. Let's pour one out for unsung innovators. Here's something you wouldn't expect. Medieval people believed alignment of the stars could affect intimacy. Certain days were more auspicious for conception. Tuesdays were bad. Fridays were dicey. But Wednesday nights during a waxing moon, that's your window. Astrology wasn't just about fate, it was bedroom scheduling. And then there were potions. Medieval apothecaries sold love potions, fertility boosters, and, well, performance enhancers. Popular ingredients: ground beetles, powdered deer antler, bat blood. One famous aphrodisiac called for mixing cinnamon with wine and goat's milk, then reciting a Latin phrase before drinking. Risky, but if it worked, worth the goat breath. One merchant in 14th century Venice sold tiny cloth packets filled with dried figs and powdered desire. He marketed them to newlyweds and claimed they increased both fire and favor. We don't know if it worked, but someone clearly made a profit. Capitalism always finds a way. But even in the most basic households, there was tenderness. Letters survive, from husbands on pilgrimage, from wives during plague years. Simple phrases like, "I long for your breath beside mine," or "Your absence darkens my meat and my mornings." Poetic, if slightly confusing on the meat part. Historians still argue whether medieval marriages were more dutiful than affectionate, but private notes suggest that love did bloom quietly in the background amid the noise and mess. And maybe that's the real heartbeat here. Amidst freezing floors and moral panic, people still reached for each other, with awkwardness, with laughter, sometimes with complete confusion, but always with hope. And as the candle flickers down to its base, you lie back on a lumpy feather-stuffed pillow and feel the story soften, because you've wandered through cathedrals, brothels, courtrooms, and kitchens. You've tiptoed past scandalous scrolls and side-eye shame masks. You've overheard gossip, dodged rotten fruit, and maybe giggled a few times. But more than anything, you've seen what never changes. People crave connection. They fumble it, they fear it, they dramatize it, but they crave it just the same. Whether whispering under haylofts or navigating Latin instructions for where not to put your knees, they're just human, just like you. And now, it's time to drift back away from flickering torches and heavy robes, from incense and itchy tunics, from whispered prayers and awkward embraces. Time for the wind down. You roll onto your side. The fire is almost out now, just a glowing memory behind your closed eyes. Let your breathing slow. Imagine the soft rustle of linen sheets, worn but clean, the muted hush of a medieval village slipping into sleep. Somewhere a rooster thinks about crowing, but not yet. Not yet. You're still wrapped in warmth, held in the gentle cradle of a world long gone but strangely familiar. And as the last candle gutters out, the final thought flickers through your mind. Even in a world of rules and rituals, shame and secrets, people still found ways to love. Whispered, clumsy, brave. Sweet dreams.